Welcome. I am Nadia Colburn, and I am here today with Harrison Blum to have a conversation about creativity, mindfulness, social justice, the body, and more. So I am the founder of Align Your Story, which offers coaching and teaching for mindful embodied writing. And I'm also interested in personal and social transformation. And Harrison Blum is the Director of Religious and Spiritual Life and Campus Chaplain at Emerson College. He is a community Dharma leader in Insight Meditation tradition, a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and the author and editor of Dancing with Dharma, Essays on Movement and Dance in Western Buddhism. And he is a producer and facilitator of conscious dance events. So thank you for being here with me, Harrison.
Delighted, Nadia.
And let's start talking about mindfulness and movement and creativity, because so often mindfulness is seen as a time when we're supposed to come into a place of stillness and come out of doing into just a kind of pure being. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think people have a misperception that when we're in that state, we can't be creative. Mm-hmm. And obviously, you show that that's not the case.
Absolutely. And I think, even to use some of your language, that state of pure being can be such a beautiful place from which to express, to create. One of my big takeaways perhaps a year and a half ago now, when the Barry Center for Buddhist Studies held its first Dharma and Arts Symposium, was that so many of us there were coming to this point of feeling and sharing that it's only half of the Dharma, it's only half of mindfulness, awareness to have insight, to have wisdom, that there's this whole other calling to live our lives in an expressive way that shows or lives from an understanding of that stillness or that insight, that clarity. So the arts are such a wonderful way to do that.
Right. I really created a little bit of a straw man to knock down, right?
Yeah.
Because ideally, everything that we do is from a mindful place. We go to the cushion to practice,
right?
But that's only practicing and training the mind so that we can then go about our lives from that place of constant mindfulness, right, and constant doing and being to that space of creativity that we take with us all the time.
Yeah, I agree. And it makes me think of a word that I sometimes like to replace or include for mindfulness is being realistic. So being mindful, when we see a cover of Time magazine with a blonde-haired woman smiling with the sun shining on her face, we might think that mindful means happy or mindful means peaceful. Certainly it can mean less stress, but not with the primary goal of fighting or confronting stress. It's, of course, more of a happy byproduct of being where we are, as we are, with less resistance.
Yeah.
So we can be a mindful dancer or a mindful writer or a mindful painter and be stressed or be concerned or be distracted, but can we be still feeling our feet on the ground and feeling that we are breathing and maybe not fighting against what is happening? Yeah.
And there's this also almost co-option of the mindful movement in mass media. I think it's a question that a lot of mindful leaders are really having a lot of discernment around. How much do we want to go into places like Google? Mm-hmm. Or sometimes I remember Thich Nhat Hanh was talking about being invited by the military, the US military. Does he go in and give the Dharma talks there? What is mindfulness being used for? Is it just being so that you can be happy and you have, as you said, it's not coincidental, the blonde, right, woman with the perfect features on Time magazine, there's certain images of what that happiness looks like, right? That how can we use this movement to be engaged with what's really happening? And sometimes what's really happening is actually distressing.
That's right.
Right?
I wonder if there's a corollary between a movement in modeling to not just have, the thinnest or the kind of stereotypically desired features on magazines, but people with realistic bodies, with different bodies. So can we have a person on Time magazine who is less attractive or less young or less happy?
Right.
And yeah, to your point about going in to do corporate trainings, there are companies out there on their websites speaking about the thousands of dollars per employee that companies can save if their employees are more mindful. And some of these companies are charging up to $400 an hour to come in and teach these mindfulness teachings. So definitely, I think that gives me pause, other people pause. But then I was just rereading a story where John Kabat-Zinn, who created mindfulness-based stress reduction, talks about going into such a corporate setting. And afterwards, as a result of tuning in, several of these people left their corporate jobs. So I think there is the potential to transform lives and not just make more efficient workers.
Right. And even within a corporate job, how can individuals within those corporations live more consciously and be more mindful? Can we have more conscious companies, right? Which is a whole movement in and of itself, to have conscious businesses.
Right.
Which also brings me to something else that you've been doing a lot of, which is bringing mindfulness to different communities. So that intersection of mindfulness and creativity is also an intersection of mindfulness and social justice work, right? That we're not just on the mat, but we're really bringing it to other people, walking the walk in our lives. And you've done a lot of really interesting work teaching in less traditional places where mindfulness is, why don't you tell a little bit about where some of the different places you've taught mindfulness and brought mindfulness?
Thanks so much. So there's some great companies out there that offer mindfulness to people with less resources, often focusing on people of color. Baltimore, the Lineage Project. New York, or rather that's Holistic Life Foundation. New York has the Lineage Project, and Fleet Mall doing wonderful things with the prison mindfulness work. And so those are wonderful, but those are companies, I assume, with a lot of grant writing efforts, with staffing needs. A gap that I see is that there are many, many qualified mindfulness teachers, Buddhist teachers, who maybe could, for 1 month a year, offer a series in partnership with a local community center serving low-income people, serving people of color. So that's the nature of a model I created called the Mindfulness Allies Project. And it was great. I did it for 2 summers. More than half the people attending were people of color. Most of the people were earning, if you can believe this, less than $15,000 a year per their self-reported income. And the benefit was great. People able to follow through and attend doctor visits, improved relationship to chronic pain, to relatives, friends. So my hope is that that there can be more partnership between people already teaching mindfulness and those who could benefit from it. And key aspects of that model is that the classes are free, childcare is provided for free, dinners are provided for free. So I was told by single mothers they wanted to learn to meditate for years, but could not get out of the childcare and the dinner responsibility.
Right. Yeah, that's so important to really provide the services that the communities need. And
Right.
I'm interested in that because I think there is sometimes a perception that mindfulness is for those people who look like the woman that the straw woman on the cover of Time magazine.
Right.
And so it's this, white upper middle class pursuit. When your material needs are satisfied, then you can go drink some nice tea and sit on the cushion. Right. And what has been your experience of the interest in mindfulness in other communities?
It's been really high. I think it does help that it's becoming more of a popular term. It is used in the media more. Oprah Winfrey interviewed Thich Nhat Hanh. These things are helping. I think that mindfulness is not going to put food on the table. It's not going to shelter someone. And yet we're at a point where it's well documented that racism causes stress, that stress impacts immune system and increases mortality rates. So quite literally, we could, I think, be saying that poverty and racism kills people. And so let's not substitute material aid with mindfulness, but let's include mindfulness with material aid. Another example, happy to have Emerson College's support, where I'm now working to once a week teach mindfulness at a nearby shelter to the residents of the shelter. So all the people are formerly homeless. They do pay some rent. They live above the floors that serve the drop-in currently homeless folks. And that has been beautiful. One person literally said, "This is my first time meditating in 40 years, and I feel like a weight has been lifted off of my shoulders."
Yeah, it's so powerful. And I always think of Thich Nhat Hanh talking about how when boat people were coming and escaping Vietnam, which he was really involved in helping thousands and thousands of people make that passage. And he said that the people who had meditated, had a good mindful practice, were much less likely to die in those boats, because in a case of such high stress, where just rocking the boat a little could tip the boat, and needing to decide where to steer it, that the mindfulness practice, the meditation practice, really helped people stay calm, make good judgments, and get through those literally rocky seas. So I think, yes, it's not going to put food on the table, but sometimes it might give someone the tools to stay through and steer through really rocky times to get to the other side.
Right.
But without practices, we just don't have as good a chance of getting to the other side.
I think that's right. And so it's not a matter of perfect healing, but like with that example, I was thinking of, can someone actually show up to a doctor appointment and get needed medical care or not? Can they show up to a job interview? If they get to a job interview, can they speak relatively well, or are they kind of paralyzed by anxiety or depression?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that this is, I feel like my mindfulness practice has gotten me through some really rocky and rough seas. There are days that I just, and weeks and months and even years, like that I really felt like my mindfulness practice was an anchor and my mind would start racing. I did some really intense healing from some early childhood trauma. And sometimes it just felt like a wave coming over me. And to have that practice, to be rooted in the present, to have a different perspective, to be able to find my breath and come back to it and reconnect with my body, so powerful. So I think so many of us, whatever our situations are, we can experience those times of real rockiness, that's when we need the practice.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I hope not to misquote Bruce Lee, but I by several people I've been told that he said that something like, when times are challenging, we don't fall back to the level of our hopes, but the kind of strength of our practice. Something to that effect, which I do appreciate.
And so what brought you to mindfulness?
I think fascination with what I was reading as a 17-year-old in a world religion class about Buddhism, about humans as part of nature aware of itself, a practice that could increase emotional awareness, mental awareness. I think I'm a big fan of wonder, and I do think that amidst the real possibility for mindfulness to make people less stressed, to make me less strung out, that it also can increase wonder and simple gratitude. So that's equally why I'm interested.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Boston, and somehow I've spent almost my entire life here. That wasn't my plan from the beginning. I was a 20-something hippie with dreadlocks wanting to move to San Francisco, but the job didn't pan out, and I have been very happy to have many chapters of my life now in Boston.
Yeah, it's a good place, and there are lots of, it's nice to have a home base, right? To really be rooted someplace. It
really does mean something, I feel, to both have a childhood and adolescent and at this point I would say a few adult chapters in the same city, especially as I go back and read about like busing in Boston, different racial histories, political histories, to have that sense that my own life has largely been here too. I would say it feels grounding, even though I have to also say I guess I will use the word ashamed of of some of the Boston Globe findings that Boston is the most white city in the country, perceived by African Americans to be the least welcoming city. I mean, these are realities that need to be faced and changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And as working at Emerson, what's your experience there with that community?
It's beautiful. I asked a student recently if he felt that whether being a student was like living in the movie Fame, or I'm not remembering it now, but some of these kind of iconic 80s movies about going to art schools or dance schools. And he said probably, but I don't know those movies. But you know, there is a high demand when you have a video project, a choreography project, an editing project going on. It's not a 2-hour commitment. It's often a day-long commitment, a weekend commitment. So the students take on a lot, and I commend them for it. It can build the stress of the environment at times, and it's also life-giving. I think it's a very vibrant school because people are following their creative passions.
Mm-hmm. What's the racial climate there? Since you were talking about race in Boston, I just want to go back to that before we jump.
Yeah, huge question. Good question. We are among other Boston schools, and I commend the Boston Globe for the series they're doing this week on race and racism in Boston. They're reporting that a handful of Boston schools, many of them, have had no increase in African American matriculations for the past many decades. So that's a phenomenon that's happening, unfortunately, more in this city than I think anyone than I would like to see. We have also, I would say, increased our international student population, which is also paralleled by other schools. And there has been a petition by students of color at Emerson to make some changes, to create a position that would look at the curriculum and make sure it's inclusive, diverse, certain scholarships for domestic students of color, transparency about growth in certain areas, orientation focusing on diversity and inclusion. Some of these pieces were actually well in place before the petition. They just hadn't yet been rolled out or advertised. Since the petition, other good actions have happened. So I feel happy and proud and confident in the work that's being done at Emerson, and it is work that is ongoing, and it's not done yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that, again, just to come back to this idea of mindfulness being something that you practice on the mat so that you can be awake to the world around you. And it's easy, even for me in Cambridge, to think, oh, you know, my kids go to Cambridge Rindge and Latin, it's pretty diverse, but I'm not there. And I know Rindge and Latin is also thinking a lot about how to deal with segregation within the school. But how do we go from our mat to then taking that insight and that awareness out to the world and saying, okay, so we have more tools perhaps. How can we use them to be of service?
Right. And
how can we reach out to others and make a difference?
That's right. And I think it is a situation where more training is needed. That's one of the tenets of the MAP model, Mindfulness Allies Project model, that beyond training in mindfulness, we need to be trained in feminism, anti-racist awareness, class awareness, a host of other things. So we can be very in tune and sensitive, but as a white person, we often have blind spots where we need that education. We need allies. I held a group recently co-facilitated with a white professor called Being White. It was a space for white identifying students to gather and share that ally work to educate each other. You know, there are drawbacks to that approach, but one real benefit was that there were several instances of white students saying to each other, oh, that's really helpful. That question is really helpful. Ways of decentering ourselves as allies, supporting people of color. So certainly I think mindfulness is great. Maybe mindfulness helps us show up and listen. And then there are these great tools we need to help us know where to look and how to look.
Right. And as important it is to be aware of different groups of people, also to use the teachings, for me at least, to use the teachings of mindfulness, of interbeing, so that we don't get stuck in the categories, because the
Right.
categories from the beginning are humanly made categories, right? Race is not like it's not like a scientific thing,
Right.
right? And we know that we all are.
Right.
We're all related. So how do we come out of these rigid ways of seeing and say we're and at the same time recognize the unique struggles of some groups of people?
Exactly. So, I mean, a simple way I think to encapsulate what you're saying, which is so important, is and others say it too, is that race is not real, but racism is real. The
Right.
impact of race is real. I was very heartened to hear our director of intercultural student affairs here, Tamia Jordan, recently said that she really wants the cultural groups to be known not just as gathering to fight oppression, but gathering for joy, for fun, for casual hangouts, right? Can
Yeah.
someone's identity not just be seen as a form, as leading to oppression, even though that can be the case, but like you're saying, not all of them, not the only thing happening.
Right. I love that gathering for joy and that cultivation of joy, which brings me back to, the dance that you do, um, and re-inhabiting our bodies
Right.
so that they can be places of transformation to have that joy be expressed.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about what you do in your mindful dance groups, and also maybe a little bit about the book that you co-edited?
Sure, sure. It's a wonderful gateway. I mean, so I think in the West, there is happily talk about widening the gateway, the entryway into mindfulness, into Buddhist practice. And I think the moving body is a lovely way to do that. We can move, we can dance, we can stretch regardless of our religious or spiritual inclinations. So for a chunk of years, for 3 or so years, I led something called Dharma Jam, which was mostly free-form dance, totally improvisation, also supported by a light structure that aligned with the refuge practice of Buddhism, and also the 3 characteristics of Buddhism of impermanence, interconnection, and I mean, suffering would be the traditional definition, but I like to think of it as the ease that's possible when we don't resist change and interconnection. So there was a Buddhist framing of this improv dance event. More recently, the last 4 years, my wife and I founded something called Nectar, which happens twice a month. I would say it's a little more open. There's an opening circle, an invitation, an experience, a movement, a meditation is offered with some guidance that then seeds the way for 75 minutes of totally open improvisational movement and dance. One consistent aspect is that the structure has the music starting very mellow, very spacious, gaining intensity. We do get to a high level of energy, of rhythm, a dance party, and then it brings it down so that by the end, people are lying down on the floor, they're moving slowly together. We close with a seated reflection circle where people can speak about what they experienced.
Lovely. And where is
Yeah,
that? So people
that's at the Dance Complex in Central Square, first and third Sunday afternoons. It's on
great.
their schedule. And we also encourage there not to be talking, so we really try to limit it as a social space and encourage it as a space to embody and express. So the structure is very light, but it is enough. Starting together, ending together, no talking, having an arc to the music. It's enough that it really is a sacred practice. People regularly speak not only of the joy in the movement, but the healing of the space.
Yeah. To have that opportunity to really listen to the body and move the body and be embodied in whatever way you feel moved, literally, to
Yes.
be,
Yeah.
is really powerful.
It is. Yeah. We encourage people to pay more attention to what it feels like than what it looks like.
Right.
That's a radical shift right there.
Right. And so many of our stories, because I work with people who are uncovering and sharing and telling and writing their stories, so many of our stories are stored in our body. And sometimes our body knows things that our mind doesn't even know. So to have that opportunity to really speak one's stories through the body can be really powerful.
Absolutely. My wife is a dance movement therapist, so I've really appreciated seeing through her training, through her work, that potential. Certainly, this isn't a facilitated space with that kind of individual attention,
Mhm.
and yet it is a space where people can look strange, to just put it simply. They can lie on the floor during dance music. They can move quickly during slow music. They can move spasmodically or rhythmically. It doesn't have to make sense or be beautiful. And so, like you're saying, everything that's stored in the body, without understanding even, can be released, expressed, moved through, moved with.
Right. And a chance to engage with that judgment mind. Like, whoa, I grew up and trained in ballet in New York City. So there was a lot of that judgment mind around the body, how you're held, what you look like, right? And so sometimes these are opportunities to really work with that own judgment. Yeah.
Right. It's not uncommon for me to hear from a classically trained dancer that they often have a harder time with improv dance than someone who has no training at all.
Mm-hmm. And then you also edited this book about movement. And that's an interesting process too, to write about and help others write about this experience of being in the body. Because you say in these nectar classes, it's quiet. You're not using language. You're just using, or you're not using verbal language.
Right.
And how do you make that translation? This is interesting also for many of the people I work with and for myself too. How do we put into language the experiences of our bodies?
Right. It is a beautiful challenge. I love writing, reading, editing, so I'm a fan of the written word, and I also am aware of its limitations when we're trying to put a embodied experience onto that page. Um, One thing I found, I mean, so lots of ways to answer your question. One thing that struck me was that some of the more established elder Buddhist teachers who also have a dynamic movement practice had a really tough time getting that onto the page. I won't name names, but some of the people that I regard as teachers, as mentors, gave me chapters that I had to just totally rearrange, create new sections, cross things out, say what was missing. So as you well know, it's not just automatic that what makes sense in experience translates smoothly to the written word.
Right. That's also good to remember, right? That you can have so much experience, so much knowledge, so much insight. And sometimes it takes time and help to get it on the page. It's not always an easy translation process.
Right. And as I said, we could probably all use this reminder. As I said to a student at Emerson recently who received a paperback with a lot of edits, I tried to instill the point that that's actually a sign of respecting you as a skilled writer. That's bringing you in. It's not calling you out, it's calling you in.
Right.
So I think through this experience of editing and giving people tons of feedback in my own submissions, receiving lots of suggestions, I crave it now. Yes, give me 50 things I need to change. That's 50 ways I can improve the strength of this paper.
And that's practice, right? That it's everything is a practice, that we're always evolving, we're always growing, we're always getting new tools. It's not like, you know what, I meditated for 3 years or for 30 years and I'm done. I've got it all figured out. I don't have to do it anymore. My practice time is done and now I'm just enlightened.
Right.
Like we're always, and there's always a new project and we need to learn the new skills for the new project. It's like having a kid. Like you think, oh, finally figured out the
Right.
twos, and then they turn 3.
I believe that. I will say one thing that I was kind of stumbled along by accident is that so there's 27 contributors. I'm one of them. There's 26 others from 6 different countries. And of those 27 people, 9 of us founded a distinct or new Buddhist organization or center or tradition in some certain ways. So, that's less than half, but I still think that 1/3 is a significant number. And I take that to mean that there's an overlap between Western Buddhists who are innovating with movement and dance in their practice and also showing leadership, bringing the Dharma, bringing Western Buddhism into new needed directions. So I think that speaks well of the leadership shown by Buddhist dancers, by dancing Buddhists.
Yeah, and the potential, the power of connecting with the body.
Mm-hmm.
How that leads to new forms and the need for new forms, and the leadership almost rises through that connection with the body, maybe. I don't know. But
Yeah, I like that. Absolutely. Yes.
but it also shows that everything is evolving, right? That our spiritual practices come from ancient traditions and are always still evolving.
Right.
That we're always adapting and changing.
Right. And as it's been said by some Buddhist studies scholars, the ancient traditions that we adapt from, at some point, many of them were adaptations from other traditions. So yes, let's be careful about cultural appropriation, about how radically we are transforming, or especially if we're borrowing or trying to replicate traditions from other times, other cultures. You know, I have to be careful saying this as a white straight man, but I do think that there is room, that it's okay to adapt Buddhism in the West, to bring in dance, to drop certain forms of ritual, not to say this is Tibetan Buddhism, but to say this maybe is American Buddhism, or this is Western Buddhism, or this is secular mindfulness. As long as there's benefit being offered and sensitivity to where it's coming from, I think those are good parameters.
And certainly as a woman, right? I mean, for women to participate in so many forms, spiritual forms or art forms, there needed to be some real shifts. There needed to be real, changes of vision, and leaders coming forward and saying, we also are at this table, which is in a way what we've been talking about this whole time. It's yes, and, right? Bringing in different communities, bringing in different practices, bringing in the body, right?
Yes.
Making it inclusive in so many ways, and open to change and open to new leadership, and coming to one's own authority and saying, I want to make a difference.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of the orange on the Seder plate as a symbolic act to speak up for the place of women in Judaism, for their right, their place to have a voice, to show leadership. Right. So how can we bring in symbols, actions, practices, modalities that are more inclusive? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's a nice place to kind of leave the listeners with that invitation to go back and learn from the wisdom of traditions and art forms, and to listen deeply to how you're called to participate in whatever way it is that you can bring your embodied practice and your spiritual practice and your social justice awareness into the world, and just show up.
Yeah, we're all needed. So I completely agree. What is your voice and how can you share it? That's very true.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much for being here with me. And I'm going to check out some of your Nectar events. So
I'd love to see you there.
It'll be fun. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.